What's up, boys? It's Nick from Team Table 501 here. I'm the king of the scrubs, and today I wanted to point something out and just do a video for you guys. So Davinator1212 on his channel is doing a Battle of the Budgets tournament, and through watching his streams and through watching the feature matches, there is one thing that I keep taking away from it, and is that these people do not know how to deck build to save their fucking lives. Now, I don't know context, I don't know what people are doing, but this is just my approach to budget deck building and how I think you should be approaching it in the same mindset, mentality, and theories that I will be showing you in this video. So, there's nothing really much more for me to say. Let's just get started. So, there's one thing I really want you to understand, and it's upgrading versus downgrading. I'll start with downgrading, as I think it's the weaker of the two mentalities.
You have to go outside.
Downgrading is taking a deck list and replacing the expensive cards with cheaper alternatives. So, for example, if you were to take a look at, say, a pendulum deck that top 32, say a YCS, or top 8 at a regional, and you see that's playing 3 copies of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, you can't afford that card, or you don't have that card, you decide to replace it with 3 copies of Effect Veiler. Or let's say in the extra deck it plays 2 copies of Psyframe Lord Omega, and it plays 2 copies of Heady Metal Foes Electromite. You can't afford those cards, so instead of Omegas, you decide to play something like a Scarlight Red Dragon Archfiend and a Stardust Dragon, and instead of the Electromites, you decide to play, just bigger Link monsters, or you just replace them with a couple of more rank 4s. Now, what you're doing is you're just taking a deck and you're playing a incredibly weakened version of that deck, meaning if you were to play a lot of mirror matches, you would continuously lose your mirror matches, especially if your opponents have the cards that you are missing. That gives them the edge. This is why downgrading is so bad in a tier 0 to tier 1 format. Because if everybody has these super expensive broken cards and you don't, and you want to play that deck because you think it's fun or it's relatively cheap otherwise, then you're going to be losing a lot of games because you don't have access to those cards. Take Dinosaurs, for example. When Dinosaurs first came out, there was a true King Dino version that could just OTK you pretty much every game, or almost every game, but it required 3 copies of Draconic Diagram, 1 copy of the Fire True King, 1 copy of the Rank 9, and a copy of Trish. And overall, the Earth True King wasn't expensive, but the Fire True King was around $25, and Diagrams were $50. So if you were playing the Lost World version, your deck was less consistent, but it gave you more power through Ultimate Conductor Tyranno getting through tokens. This is why downgrading is so, it doesn't accomplish much. Now sure, you get to play a meta deck, or at least the core of a meta deck, but you don't get to play the cards that make the deck powerful. You just get to play the shell, which is why I think the second theory or practice, upgrading is better. So upgrading is when you pick a deck that's cheap or underrated and you build it to the best of your ability while staying on a budget. And I'll talk about that momentarily. But I have a few examples up on the screen here that I wanted to talk about. So Paleo. Paleo has always been a cheap deck except for when Toad first came out. The frogs have slowly kept up in price. However, if you don't want to play the frogs, you don't have the frogs, or you want to play a different version of Paleo, go right ahead. You don't even have to play the Spellbook version. You can just play frogs as your only monsters in the deck. There's so many different ways you can take Paleozoic, and the deck is all common and rare. A couple of the cards are super rare, but even the staples like Bottomless, Warning, Torrential, Monster Reborn, Soul Charge, Upstart Goblin, all those cards are common, meaning that they're relatively cheap and very easy to find. Dinosaurs is a fucking structure deck. Monarchs are a structure deck. I'm completely biased, that's why they're here. But that deck, that is the definition of a deck that can be built on a budget regardless of format. For one, it's a structure deck, and for 2, its cards almost can't be power creeped. It's ridiculous. Same thing with ABC. You buy 3 AB... You buy 3 of the legendary Kaiba structure deck or whatever it's called, and there's half your ABC deck right there. Pick up your gold gadgets, your desires, your soul charges. For $60, you got a pretty good tier 2 deck right there. And that's what I bubbled regionals with a $60 ABC deck. And so I like upgrading for 2 reasons. For one, most of the deck is already built for you depending on the archetype that you pick. So for example, Monarchs, pretty much around 30 of your cards have already been picked for you because you have to play cards that synergize. You have to play that archetype, especially out of a structure deck. But if you pick something like Paleo, you have a little more flexibility. But again, it varies to the deck. So if you pick a structure deck like Dino, ABC, or Monarchs, a lot of your cards have just already been pre-selected for you because they're in the structure deck and they're really, really good. So like Dinosaurs, for example, 3 Oviraptor, 3 Fossil Dig, 3 Baby Ceratosaurus, 1 Miscellaneousaurus, 2 Twin Twisters, 3 Lost World, 3 Terraforming. That's like half the deck right there. $30 and you have half of the deck. So like, and you don't even need to play an extra deck. Like, that's insane, but that's another thing too. I'll talk about that later, and again, the second reason you get to upgrading, I think, is better, is because you get to play underrated, fun tech cards, and I'll talk about that in my next slide here, or I guess the slide after this. I completely forgot the order I did this in. I did this last night. So, staples. I cannot stress this enough. When you are building a budget deck, staples are by far the best use of your money. Even if it's just a deck like Dinosaurs, where you just need 3 of the structure deck, that's $30 of how much of your budget. So let's say, for example, you're on a $100 budget. You get 3 of the structure decks for $30. That's great. That's awesome. Where's that other $70 go? These cards. Pot of Desires, Raigeki, Effect Veiler, or your hand trap of choice. Board Wipes, Dark Hole, Interrupted Kaiju Slumber, possibly Torrential Tribute. Just good staple 1 of Solemn Warning, Solemn Judgment, Monster Reborn, Soul Charge. 1-for-1 if you want to, or Reinforcement of the Army. Cards like Destrudo, Ancient Fairy Dragon, Dragon Ravine. Just these all-around flexible cards that can go into multiple decks is the best use of your money. Same thing with extra deck cards. Rank 4s are probably the best use of your money for your extra deck. Baguska, for the Dinosaurs in specifics. Dolka and Lagia. Castel, Abyss Dweller. And even Link monsters, like picking up a copy of Decode Talker, picking up a copy of Underclock Taker, picking up a copy of Proxy Dragon. Just these very good generic staple cards that can go in multiple decks regardless of your budget. This is one of the best things you can do. Especially if it's cards like Raigeki or the Kaiju Engine that are pretty much always going to be playable. So even though you're putting $20 into a Raigeki, which I know is a lot for your budget, the fact that you constantly get to play Raigeki and you only need 1 for every deck that you build, and you can just switch it from deck to deck, means you don't need to buy Raigeki over and over again. You could just buy 1 and just replace it with your deck. Or replace it between your decks. You only need to buy 1 set of staples and you're set. That's why they're so good. That's why this is one of the best things you can do as a budget player. Put your money in the staples. And so when you're picking an archetype, these are some of the things that you want to consider. This is mostly for competitive play. If you're just playing for fun or you're playing at your local, sure, you want to win, but these aren't at the front of your mind or at the top of your mind. But if you're trying to go to a regional or a YCS, these are things you need to talk about. Or these are things that you need to think about when building and deck selecting. So, you want to pick an archetype or a deck that can win games both against the metagame and the prevalent rogue decks. It doesn't matter if you can beat the Yosenju player at your locals or the Cyber Dragon player at your locals. If you can't compete with Draco and Penmage, you don't want to play that deck. That deck is not going to be a good choice. Or if your deck can beat Penmage and Draco, but it can't beat decks like Trickstar, ABC, Lightsworn, that deck might not also be a good choice. Now, sure, maybe those matchups are 50-50, but I'd much rather have 50-50 matchups against everything than 90-10 against meta and 10-90 against rogue, because most of the time, your first 3 to 4 rounds of an event are going to be rogue decks / lower tier decks. That's almost half of your tournament. And I don't want my matchup to be 10-90 against it just because I decided to pick a budget deck. You want to focus on power and consistency. A lot of these new structure decks have done a very good job at balancing power and consistency. However, some decks like Dinosaur have an incredibly high power ceiling, but it has very low consistency and are incredibly fragile. That's another thing, too. Like, I love Monarchs and all, but the deck is fragile. You know if something gets stopped, you literally can't play. Your turn is done. Push the button. You want to make sure your deck not only has consistency, but you also want to make sure that it has power. It has an incredibly strong play. It has the ability to put a decent amount of damage or possibly game on the board in just one turn without using cards like Soul Charge or Monster Reborn or stuff like that. In archetype cards. You also want to make sure your deck has a power play to close games out quickly. Paleo is good at this because even though they're a control deck, they can still use their Frog to make cards like Mastar Boy, Deco Talker, Skull Dread. That's not budget, but it proves my point. You know, they can put massive amounts of damage on the board, even though they're a control deck. And you also want to make sure that your deck has a boss monster that can advance the game plan of your archetype, or is your deck's win condition. You know, cards like Invoked Makaba, ABC Dragon Buster, Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, Heavy Metal Foes Electromite, Masterpiece. You know, cards that just, they help you win the game. They are how you win the game. So, for budget decks, for example, like Paleo, Toad is your win condition. That's your boss monster. Other rogue decks, let's see. You know, something like Harpies or whatever. Maybe Lightning Shield is your win condition, or maybe the Pet Phantasmal Dragon is your win condition. You know, maybe you're playing something like Water, where Moon Glacia is your win condition, or Megalo is your win condition, or Neptibus is your win condition. And the most important thing here is to make sure, don't go over budget. Don't pick a deck that has one card at like $30 and the rest is super cheap, because then that eats up most of your budget and you don't get to invest in staples. You know, Draco was a really good example of this. Draco was a really good budget deck when it first came out, because everything was relatively cheap, including the masterpieces. The only thing that was expensive was diagrams. So you could pick up a true Draco core for maybe like $80, pick up some good side deck cards, and then just leave the diagrams alone until they either got reprinted or went down. So don't go over budget for the sake of one card. And then here's some of just like my thoughts. This is something that I want you to take away from this video outside of my other points. Just because you're on a budget doesn't mean you could play bad cards, you know? Just because you can't afford Regeki doesn't mean you should play Lightning Vortex. Lightning Vortex is an incredibly terrible card that doesn't do anything to advance the game plan of your deck. I'd much rather play a card like Torrential Tribute that is slower, but has a much higher impact on the game, and has a much higher impact and synergy with my deck. You know, same thing. Just because you can't afford Solemn Strike doesn't mean you can play Dark Bribe. Dark Bribe is a terrible card, but there are other replacements that you can use. Budget does not equal casual, and vice versa. Casual does not equal budget. I'm a competitive player, or a semi-competitive player.
Anything else?
That doesn't mean that I play the meta decks. I'm just a budget competitive player. Same thing, how some people have, you know, Electromites, but they're playing them in their stupid, you know, Abyss Actor deck because they think it's fun. You know, they would define themselves as casual, which is perfectly fine. But the two are not interrelated. Sometimes they are. I will give them that. But for the majority of cases, they're not. You also want to make sure that your deck is cohesive and uses proper ratios. What I mean by this is that if you have an archetype card that says once per turn, or is essentially once per turn without being printed on the card. So, for example, cards like A Hero Lives. Cards like Fright for Fusion, that's once per turn. I don't know if Goki Rematch is once per turn, actually. But yeah, you want to make sure that you're not, like, overboard. Like, essentially, you want your deck to flow. You want your deck to be consistent. You want your deck to do the same thing over and over and over again. And, like, if your deck has a super powerful boss monster, but it's not that easy to summon, maybe you only play one copy of it instead of 3. You know, maybe you have a bunch of cards that are once per turns. So maybe you play 2 of all of them, or maybe you mix around the ratios. You know, you really need to figure it out for yourself.
Are you going to go to house, bro?
You want to have fun. Like, the game is supposed to be fun. But make sure that both the deck and the build is good. Just because you're trying to have fun doesn't mean that you should build a budget Cloudian deck. You know, build something... You know, I know fun is subjective and all, but... Again, we're going under the mindset here that you're trying to win some games. So make sure that the deck is good. The internet's your best resource. TCGplayer.com helps you find the cheapest prices. I love that website. Use it. It also helps you find deck lists so that you can either upgrade or downgrade. And budget is different for everyone. So, you know, if somebody's budget is $50, don't harp on them for that. Help them out. My budget's $100, but that doesn't mean that everybody else's is. You know, some people's budget is $200. Again, it all depends on the format, the person, and the deck. So consider that when you are deck building. And that is about it. This is just... Again, I really wanted to help the players out here. As like I said, when I was watching Davinator's stream, a lot of the decks just weren't that great, and they weren't built great. So I hope this helps you out. My name is Nick from Team Table 501. Share this with your friends. Thanks for watching and get good scrubs. I'll see you next time.